Good evening. I'm Seti Warren, Executive Director of the Institute of Politics at Harvard Kennedy School. Welcome to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum. Tonight's forum is a part of the Reckoning with the Past, Rebuilding the Future speaker series, co-hosted by the Institutional Anti-Racism and Accountability Project at Ash Center and the Institute of Politics. Before I introduce our panel, I'd like to announce a land acknowledgement. We wish to acknowledge that the land on which Harvard sits, and we are meeting today, is the traditional territory of the Massachusetts people, and is a place which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange among nations. While we live in precarious times for many reasons, we also have cause for hope. Voices and intellect that may not have been lifted in many spaces in our society are being lifted today. As referenced in my introduction, we must reckon with the past to rebuild the future. And that's why I'm honored to introduce two extraordinary people to the forum this evening. Amber Payne is currently co-editor-in-chief of the Emancipator at the Boston Globe. Boston University's Center for Anti-Racist Research and the Boston Globe have collaborated to resurrect and reimagine the Emancipator, the first abolitionist newspaper in the United States, founded more than 200 years ago. By putting academic expertise into conversation with lived experiences, it showcases missing and under-amplified voices, past and present, and they reveal about the way forward. Eddie S. Glaude Jr. is the James S. McDonald Distinguished University Professor at Princeton University. Dr. Glaude is an award-winning author, MSNBC commentator, and leading public intellectual who examines the complex dynamics of race and racism in the American experience. His books include Democracy in Black, How Race Still Enslaves the American Soul, In a Shade of Blue, Pragmatism and the Politics of Black America, and his most recent book, the New York Times bestseller, Begin Again, James Baldwin's America and Its Urgent Lessons for Our Own. It is an honor to welcome both of you to the forum. And Professor Glaude, I listened to your book, as I said, this summer, and I'm so glad it's in the public sphere. I'll hand it over to Amber. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you to all of the Harvard team for having me here to moderate. It's definitely an honor to be here with you, Professor Glaude.
It's my pleasure, indeed. Thank you, Seti, for that gorgeous introduction, gracious introduction. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. We're here to talk about reckoning with the soul of a nation and what that really means. And we've seen almost 2 years of promises of institutional anti-racist change, but what has been done and what has been undone? How do we as individuals, as institutions and policymakers leverage the new awareness and these commitments that people have been making to racial equity to dismantle structural racism in the United States? So those are some of the things we want to talk about. Those are big things. And I know that there are going to be a lot of great questions, but we're going to get to some current events, the political climate, the administration. But I want to start with Begin Again, which I also listened to. And the title is just so fitting. It feels like we keep hitting reset on the democracy button and on the American project every week. So I wanted you to set up a couple of concepts and contextualize our conversation. Your book, Begin Again, it's a masterful work of some memoir and a spotlight on Baldwin's prophetic writings and how we can look to him for perspective and inspiration. And, one theme is you highlight and you share his belief that America has been lying to itself since its founding. You wrote about the lie and what that mechanism is. So could you break down that concept that you expound upon in the book about the lie?
Sure. Well, first of all, it's such a delight to be in conversation with you. And we want to give a shout out to all of the people behind the scenes who have made this webinar possible. So yeah, in some ways, there's this moment in an essay written entitled The White Problem. Baldwin, and I'm paraphrasing him here, says that the people who founded the nation had a fatal flaw. They were Christian and they saw themselves, in some ways founding what would become a democracy. But they had these chattel, and they had to reconcile, the fact that they were holding people as chattel with their own commitments in some ways. And he says, in order to do that, they had to say that these people were not men and women. And then Baldwin writes this line, and it's a quote, because if they were not men, then no crime would have been committed. That lie is the basis of our present trouble. So there's this idea of America as the shining city on the hill, as this example of democracy achieved, as the Redeemer nation. And that particular ideological imagining runs up against our practices. And so we are constantly telling ourselves a story that the relationship between what we're doing and what we say, who we say we are, is in some ways reconcilable by us telling the story that what we're doing isn't really who we are. Right. And so that lie from the inception, from the very beginning, has, to my mind, distorted and disfigured the American. Right. So much so that we can't become the kinds of people that democracies require. And so because we've been habituated to live in that fantasy, as it were. And so Baldwin is insisting, and I agree with him, that if we're going to grow up as a nation, we have to confront that fantasy. We have to confront that lie. And he's not alone in suggesting that is the beginning of a path forward in some ways. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And even backing up a bit, you wrote about the value gap and the privatization of Black misery. You expanded on that in Democracy in Black. You wrote a lot about Ferguson and the movement. But I wanted to get the value gap. Could you put the value gap in context with the lie? You have a line, I'll just share, if what I've called the value gap is the idea that in America, white lives have always mattered more than the lives of others, then the lie is a broad and powerful architecture of false assumptions by which the value gap is maintained. So what does that, break that down for us?
Right. So I was trying to figure out how to talk about white supremacy without using the phrase. And at the heart of white supremacy is evaluation of human being, right? That some people are valued more than others, while others are generally disregarded, right? Or devalued. And of course, in the commerce, it's also kind of referencing the commerce of slavery, as it were, right? How are these, what's the use value of these particular bodies in certain ways, right? And so the value gap is this belief that white people matter more than others. And then that belief informs and shapes our practices, our economic, social, and political arrangements. And it looks differently over time. What the value gap looks like in the context of slavery will be very different than the value gap in the context of Jim Crow, or look very differently in the context of the first African-American president. But the society is still organized in such a way that certain people are valued more than others. And then we tell a series of stories to ourselves to justify that differentiation. Oh, they lack intellectual capacity. Oh, they lack reason. They're motivated principally by their passions. Oh, they're criminal in their orientation. They're licentious, generally immoral, devalued in some ways, right? In Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth, he says in the context of colonialism that the colonist says of the colonized that they are completely lacking in value. They're not moral agents at all. Simply, means to be used to someone else's ends. Heteronymous, to use Kant's language. And so the lie is this broad architecture, right, to protect us, to protect our innocence in the face of that logic, right? And then to displace it, that is the valuation, onto the very bodies who are bearing the brunt of it in the first place. It's our fault. It's Black folks' fault that we are considered less than, in a way. That's what I was trying to reach for. And I'm glad you put those two in tandem, because the two books are part of a trilogy, right? So the first is Democracy in Black, which sets the frame, then bringing Baldwin on stage, and then the one I'm working on now tries to somehow bring it all together.
Okay, well, we will stay tuned for that third part of the trilogy. But I think it's important to talk about who's being protected. That's kind of really a theme at this time, I think, in a lot of the topics in the political climate. And I want to turn to policing and George Floyd. I mean, that's part of the reason that we're here today. You wrote in the Post last month about the racial reckoning, what we thought was a racial reckoning after the murder of George Floyd, and the protests turned out to be an occasion to reassert the comforting power of our national illusions and justify once again that this nation must remain white. We're in the middle of the nation's latest betrayal, you called it. So, and the question is, what can we do about it? So I ask you also, what's been done? What is your assessment as we're talking about this reckoning of the soul of a nation, and what's been done and what hasn't been done? Where would you start with that?
Wow, it's a very difficult question for me because on the one hand, we want to acknowledge an election cycle that sent Trump home, that revealed an extraordinary outpouring of civic energy on the part of the electorate. We want to celebrate what happened in Georgia with the election of Senator Warnock and Ossoff, historic elections, from a broad-based coalition. We want to acknowledge the effectiveness of grassroots organizing, where once defund the police as a shorthand was kind of workshopped among active grassroots activists for a decade or so, bubbled up and came into the broader public discourse as we were talking about holding police accountable, changing the nature of policing. We want to acknowledge our first Black American woman as first woman of color as the Vice President of the United States. We need to acknowledge the first African American woman who will hopefully ascend to be confirmed as a Supreme Court justice. But at the same time, in the midst of that reality, as I say, we are in the midst of every reckoning in the United States historically has carried with it betrayal. And we're in the midst of that betrayal. So the assault on voting rights, which is an extension of the assault on the Capitol, Stop the Steal, and the spate of voting laws that are attempts to disenfranchise Black folk and young folk and the like, the attempts at nullification that is a consistent component of these voting laws across the country, especially in Georgia and Texas and North Carolina and Michigan and the like. So there's this sense of the great replacement, right? That Stop the Steal wasn't just simply about the so-called big lie. It was also about the browning of America and how it's evidencing itself in our politics, and how white grievance and white fear and white resentment have made themselves known in our politics. So you got the great replacement, and then you have the fear of displacement, the historiographical fear. So at the very moment in which we see all the things I just described positively, the attack on voting rights, now the attack on 1619 Project, the attack on critical race theory, right? The reassertion of a certain story about America. On top of all of that, the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, dead in the water. John Lewis Voting Rights Act. And then the more radical version of those two pieces of legislation, dead in the water. And there's no clear path forward with regards to how those pieces of legislation will make their way to Biden's desk. So we're in the midst of what some will call a backlash, but I think that's too generous. We're in the midst of, right, another betrayal. And the question for us, and I know I'm talking a lot here, Amber, but how can I put this? And I've said this across the country. At every moment in which a new America is on the verge of being born, the umbilical cord of white supremacy has been wrapped around the baby's neck, choking the life out of it. And at the end of No Name in the Street, Baldwin says to us, we have to be better midwives. So here we see, the baby choking right in front of us. And we have to be much more aggressive in fighting for its life.
Yeah. Well, just let's stick with the administration for right now. It was, I think, on the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa massacre that they released a very ambitious plan on racial equity. Where do you feel there's been a clearly articulated path for racial equity from the administration? I mean, we've seen a lot that has not come through, as you just mentioned, these bills that are not there. But do you see it? How do we begin again? Where do we go now that these bills have been dead in the water and haven't gone anywhere? We're looking toward the midterms. We're looking at voting rights. But this greater path for racial equity that the administration has promised, is there anything that you're seeing that you're hopeful about?
No, but not at the current moment. I mean, I think a lot of the administrations, and this is from my vantage point, of course, it seems as if there's a kind of political calculus that the nomination of Judge Brown Jackson will satisfy the Black electorate, right? As voting is left, left behind, voting rights is left behind, and Build Back Better is dead. I mean, a lot of the racial equity policy ideally was in that legislation. And that legislation is dead in the water. And unless there is, I haven't heard, for a variety of reasons, to be generous to the administration, a variety of reasons that make sense to me, I haven't heard even a strategy about breaking the bill up in order to pursue portions of its agenda, right? Or elements of the agenda. And I remember I happened to be in the room with President Biden with those historians at the very beginning of his administration. And I can talk about it now because everybody else has been talking about it. And I remember saying to him directly that he had the chance to be a transformative president with regards to race, but he had to be bold and not, in some ways, as I'm thinking about it now, beholden to what the political consultants say about how one would pursue this agenda. So the short answer to your question is I'm not so sure what the administration's agenda is with regards to these matters. And then there's the presumption that we're going to vote for them anyway because of the illiberal alternative.
Right. And then, just this Monday, the administration announced a $17 billion federal law enforcement, to pay for violent crime, to combat violent crime. And as you said, these bipartisan efforts at reform have failed. And, the defund the police movement, I guess the messaging behind that movement has gone off the rails and has not been so productive. Biden even said something that he said, the answer is not to defund the police. He's saying that back. It's to give you the tools, the training, the funding to be protectors. What's that about?
Yeah. And it's insane. I mean, for those of us who lived through the 90s, the rhetoric is almost identical to the rhetoric that led to the expansion of the carceral state. And we know what the result of that has been. I mean, Professor Muhammad has written brilliantly on it. My own colleague, Professor Mirakawa, has written brilliantly on the effects of this discourse, this framing of law and order. We saw it, we heard it in the questioning of Judge Brown Jackson. And it was just horrific to hear that what we are basically thinking about, again, in the face of escalating crime, which we can acknowledge, although we have to kind of press that data a bit because we know how data can be deployed for these purposes in certain ways. But to fall back onto law and order, as opposed to trying to think about a broader framing of safety and security, where every community, no matter the color of their zip code, deserves to be safe and secure. But safety isn't reducible to policing. And what is revealed, at least in this moment, is not just simply we talk about a prison industrial complex, but there's a policing industrial complex in this country. And every time it's threatened, there is a kind of mobilization of resources and a kind of triggering of moral panic in order to justify a kind of doubling down on the funding for this form of policing. So it is difficult to imagine the political calculus here as he calls for more funding in this regard. And let's be clear, there's no data, at least I haven't read, to support the claim that the Democrats' difficulty at the ballot box was due to the phrase defund the police. There's no data to suggest where have police departments, what municipalities have defunded the police. And we do know too that the phrase is really just simply a shorthand for budget your values. What does it mean to think about, redistributing resources from policing and carceral remedy to actually dealing with social services that can actually benefit and affect communities in a much more positive way than locking them up and increasing the encounters between communities and people who can use deadly force.
Yeah. It seems that it's being left to grassroots and smaller groups to try to put those kinds of programs forward. And it is unfortunate that it is not something that at the federal level is something that's willing to be tackled, it seems.
Amber, I think it has something to do with who's at the center of the political imagination of political elites. I always like to say that the Democratic Party is like a forlorn lover. They've been rejected by the Reagan Democrats in 1980, and they've been trying to figure out how to get them to return. So at the center of their political imagination has always been, this is why I think the political consulting class is just as problematic as the politicians. They think that what we have to do is to appeal to the cisgendered working class male as the driver of our political efforts, and everything else will follow. And to my mind, if we don't decenter, I didn't say dismiss, but if we don't decenter that particular political figure, we will find ourselves in deep, deep trouble.
Hey, well, we have a special guest giving me a sweet potato. Thank you, Ruby. Thank you so much. Speaking of Judge Jackson, okay, I knew that was going to happen. Speaking of Judge Jackson, I did want to get back to Judge Jackson and your take. We watched her endure these hours of irrelevant questions, and it was political theater, and it was a platform for culture wars. But what else did you take away from that?
Well, it was the latest example for me of the ongoing betrayal that we're experiencing. I don't want to separate what we saw in her confirmation hearing from January 6th, from the legislative attempts across the nation to change or to disenfranchise voters of color, young people, and the like. I don't want to separate that hearing from the 175 pieces of legislation introduced across the country to dictate what teachers can teach and to do what we've seen. 13, I think, of pieces of that legislation have already been passed into law by 11 states. So I see it as a component, as a feature of this effort to or this insistence on this idea that America must remain a white nation. Charles Kirk of Turning Points put it clearly. He spoke the quiet part out loud. And these are the kinds of people that they want to rule over you. And you just kind of say, oh, there it is. Right, there it is. And I think we need to understand this, that the big lie has behind it the even bigger lie that we've been talking about. And we need to understand the intimate interrelation between that. And Judge Brown Jackson's confirmation hearing for me has to be read in that context.
This also leads just to the conversation around free speech, which I think this is a great forum to talk about this free speech debate. Earlier this month, a senior at UVA wrote a piece for the Times called "I Came to College Eager to Debate. I Found Self-Censorship Instead." There's been so much reaction and response to it. I went to UVA. All of my chats are talking about it. But, how does this tie into, these issues that teachers and professors are facing? One reader called it an educational gag order. Others have been, in support of it. And it's really become this debate over civility and honesty that people are setting up, that there's this binary. So as a professor and scholar, and what is your take on that debate?
Well, I have a lot to say about it, but, the first thing I would say is that we have to be careful because there are forces in our midst illiberal forces that will take advantage of our values for illiberal ends. So there is a commitment to free and open inquiry and debate that defines what we do in the academy.
Yeah.
And the basic assumptions that allow for free and open inquiry is that everyone is accorded dignity and standing. Everyone is accorded dignity and standing. So what we have are these moments that are often triggered by outside organizations that are trying to find the explosive moment of protest in order to billboard it as an indication of the illiberal nature of higher ed. But we have folk who are really calling into question the dignity and standing of some of the folk who inhabit our colleges and universities. So we have to figure out a fine line, how to protect our values from these illiberal forces and how to embrace them at the same time as we allow for free and open exchange of different positions, it seems to me.
Yeah.
But it's really fascinating that people are worried about, they're more concerned about a protest at Yale Law School or at UVA or at Middlebury than they are about 175 pieces of legislation or 13 laws that in some ways place teachers and professors in the crosshairs. They're more concerned about that than they are against death threats that liberal professors often face. They're more concerned about that than some of us finding our names on lists, right, of progressive teachers and then become objects of harassment, right? We can go on and on and on about the state of the environment, as it were. That's another point. The last point I would make, I told you I had a lot to say about this.
Yeah.
The last point I would say is this: we are in a moment of transition in this country, and we're trying to figure out how to be together differently. And so where the lines are drawn, right, hasn't been settled yet. You can imagine when the Jim Crow South collapsed, some people still wanted to go around talking the way Jim Crow Mississippi, the way in which they talked in Jim Crow Mississippi, and they couldn't no longer. They were shunned, right, because they were speaking in a language that we had decided was no longer appropriate in the public space. We're in a moment where Bill Maher can't say whatever the hell comes to his mind and not be held to account. And let's be clear, I can say you have a right to say whatever you want to say, but people speak, but people also answer. And you can't dictate the form and content of my offense.
Right. And my reply.
Exactly. That makes no sense to me. Right? It sounds like a group of snowflakes who are afraid to be held to account for what the hell they're saying.
Right.
But that's a different story.
But the flip side and the irony here is just what it sets up about, the laws circumscribing what you can't say, what teachers can't say. I find that to be just, it blows the mind, with the Florida lawmakers passing the bill forbidding teaching about gender identity and sexual orientation. What's next in that part of this fight?
I have no idea. There is a terror and panic at the heart, at the root of it all. There is a sense in which the country, that a certain segment of the country is losing its hold on its understanding of America. And so typically, historically, the next phase has always been violence, right? Intensification of violence. And I'm thinking of, there's a moment in the context of the Cold War in 1959. Dean Griswold at Yale gives this extraordinary speech about the importance of free and open inquiry in the face of the Red Scare. Mm-hmm. And I disagree with Griswold's politics, but he was trying to kind of give us a sense of what was happening as people were trying to police a certain politics, as it were. The next phase for me is even more dangerous, because then it's not only about police forces policing what you can say, investigative elements, the repressive arm of the state being deployed to police the boundaries of what we think of as appropriate speech and the like, but how citizens, everyday ordinary folk, are empowered to do this and what that means, coming out of the tradition out of which I come. That's a very scary prospect.
Yeah. You reference, I think in the beginning, and you reference a speech that Dr. King gave where he expressed that the movement was losing the battle for the soul of a nation. So I wanted to talk to you a bit about where we are now with that movement and your perspective. You extensively wrote about the post after Ferguson and that moment. And at Princeton, maybe that's a starting place. I think many remember, 2015, the Black Justice League on campus and the action that they were putting forward. So I guess if you could start there about, maybe let's start at that college level, at that ground level at Princeton. Give us, that context of that part of the movement. But I really want to get your idea, your answer on, given the uprisings, the movement after George Floyd, Breonna Taylor's killings, how you feel about where we are in that movement now.
It was an extraordinary moment at Princeton, because Princeton's identity is bound up with Woodrow Wilson. I mean, in some ways, it's not in some ways, it's actually a fact. He made Princeton a modern university. But, the way in which they told his story was all a sainthood. It was all hagiography, right? As opposed to dealing with the complexity of the man. And there's this sense that students at Princeton, and I'm sure at Harvard and at these predominantly white institutions, that we don't feel a sense of possession of them, that we're viewed as either objects of charity or latecomers. And so could you imagine what it meant for Princeton students to eat in a dining room, to go into a building, to do this and that? And the building's named after a man who thought they were less than. There was a reason Paul Robeson grew up down the street, but he had to go to Rutgers. Princeton is late in the game when it comes to admitting African Americans. I mean, I'm the founding chair of African American Studies at Princeton. Me, right? So it's the Southern Ivy, as it were. And so I think the Black Justice League was announcing that, no, this is my institution. We are Princeton. And the built environment must reflect this. And I think the university's response to the students taking over the president's building or to the protests, which, by the way, was part of a solidaristic effort with the students at the University of Missouri, right? So this was a part of that nationwide action in that regard. I think the university was thoughtful in the way in which it responded, because not only is Woodrow Wilson's name no longer the name of the public policy school, but the built environment was impacted. So now Morrison Hall, named after Toni Morrison, is there. So there's an understanding. But again, there's an immediate, well, what else do you want?
Mm-hmm.
Right? And
Or are you
Baldwin,
satisfied now?
yeah, Baldwin
We're
loathed
done.
that question. He loathed that question. What else? What else does the Negro want? He says, if you really thought of me like you thought of yourself, you wouldn't ask that question because you know I would want exactly what you want. You see? So where we are in this moment, any concession to a movement presents the danger to demobilize it. So not only do we have the election of Joe Biden and of course COVID-19, we also have the challenges of these young folk trying to sustain an effort, right? As traditional forces try to push them into more mainstream forms of politics, as it were. And then of course, as I said, COVID-19 disrupted everything.
Yeah.
Right. For a moment, at least.
Yeah. Yeah. I do want to ask everybody to put your questions. Actually, we're gonna open the conversation in a few minutes, and you can use the raise hand function if you'd like to ask our fellow a question. And the Institute of Politics staff will let you know when you're in queue. How would you compare just this moment of this movement, this activism now with the post-Ferguson action and activations and movements?
I haven't really, how would I compare this moment with what we saw in Ferguson?
Right after Ferguson, this uprising of activism. There were campus actions. There are some that were activists in Ferguson who are now in office. Wondering about, in this moment, there have been a lot of promises made by institutions, but as far as the activation of a people, of a multiracial group of people, is there anything that strikes you about the activation of a people kind of following those two moments?
Well, I think, the increasing radicalization of grassroots activism has everything to do with the ongoing failure to respond substantively to the demands in earlier iterations. So, you go from putting cameras on police officers and to defund the police. How do you chart that journey? Well, it has everything to do with the failures in between, right? And so part of what I think is happening among activist communities that I'm connected with is that they're reaching for new vocabularies, different ways of imagining politics, right? That aren't reducible to electoral politics defined by the actors of the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, but they're reaching for something different, right? A different way of responding to the current crisis, because they know that the country's broken. You see, they know that it's broken, and trying to figure out how best to respond to it. But at the same time, we have to acknowledge this, end. Close to a million Americans are dead.
Mm-hmm.
We keep forgetting, right? In so many ways, as we rush to some semblance of normalcy, whatever that means, that over a million people are dead, right? And that's not an abstraction. Those are people who were loved, people who were in community with others. And the last time this happened, the U.S. is really good at this. When you think about the influenza epidemic of the early 20th century, right? 1917, 1918. What did you get after that? You got the Roaring 20s, right? And so part of what this moment is all about, I think, is how do we muster the existential resources to continue to struggle as we grieve? As we grieve. I don't know what that looks like yet.
Yeah.
But Adrienne Marie Brown's book Grievers has helped me. That novel is extraordinary, right? But it seems to me that we have to begin to answer the question that you asked in light of that complex combination of an acknowledgement of the society as broken and an acknowledgement of the depth of loss and grief that occasions the moment.
Yeah, starting with acknowledgement. We are going to go to one of our questions. Ryan, you will have the first question. Please go ahead and turn your video on.
Hi, Professor.
Hi, Ryan. How are you?
Doing well, thank you. So my name is Ryan Dongwin, evidently, and I'm a first year at the college. Thank you so much for talking with us today. You made a reference to Baldwin at the beginning of the forum that if we're going to grow up as a nation, we have to confront that fantasy, that lie that what we're doing isn't reflective of who we are, because in reality, it is. And later you briefly touched upon the attack on the 1619 Project, the attack on critical race theory, the failure to advance the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act. These actions evidently reflect who we are as a nation, but they're being brushed under the rug. There's barely any conversation on them. So what can we do to take accountability for our actions, and how do we align our actions with our goals of who we want to be?
It's a really great question, and it's a hard question to answer, right? Because I think it begins in organizing and mobilizing, in the hard work close to the ground, where we are around particular issues, whether it be education, whether it be criminal justice, whether it be healthcare, and the like, right? It involves telling ourselves the truth about who we are, right? That means that we have to put forward different sorts of stories to frame our organizing and mobilizing efforts. So 1619 Project, for example. I can have arguments with Nicole Hannah-Jones about the details of the 1619 Project. I don't believe in origin stories. I'm more like Edward Said. I think the problem is the problem of beginnings. As he put it in his book, the problem of beginnings is the beginning of the problem. Where you start matters. Right. So if you start with 1619 as opposed to Plymouth Rock, what comes into view? Well, slavery, the fact that America was a corporation before it was a country, indentured servitude, class, Native peoples, failure. Failure comes into view. The kinds of stories we tell, what we choose to leave out, right, actually often reveals the limits of our conceptions of justice, you see. So how we organize, how we mobilize, how we fight around a set of issues that define, that hopefully chart a different path of our being together, right? I think also must involve a different kind of story that we tell about who we are so that we can imagine being together differently. So I look at what Reverend Barber's doing with the Poor People's Campaign as an example of this in certain ways, right? As an example on the ground. Right, it's a certain way of thinking about mass mobilization. So that's the beginning of an answer to a very big question, right? But in order to do this, you have to be willing to look the ugliness of who you are squarely in the face, right?
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ryan. I appreciate you, Doc.
Appreciate you too.
Thanks, Ryan. Great question. Kate, you're next.
Hi. Sorry, there's a siren outside, so I hope that's not
that's okay.
making it too hard to hear. I'm Kate. I'm a sophomore at the college. So I guess following up on sort of the answer to the last question, I don't mean to get too nitty gritty, but I guess I would ask, there's a lot of work both to be done on a more grassroots level and with individual organizers, but there's also so much work obviously to be done on the government side and kind of by these bigger bodies. So I guess my question is, how do you think that those groups can and should work together to put together the kind of change that needs to happen?
Yeah, I mean, this is really important. I'm always thinking about the local as the site of really substantive politics. This is where the pavement, the rubber hits the pavement, right? In certain ways, this is where cities or municipalities can decide this is the standard of living. This is the basic social compact that we have in my little hometown. We can make the case that if you live here, you should make a decent living wage. If you live here, you could have access to decent housing. There's a way in which the local has to be networked, right, with other elements. That is the county, if I'm understanding the question correctly, Kate, with the county, the state, and the national level. Oftentimes, we're so focused on DC that we lose sight of what ought to happen and what's happening downstream. So I believe there is a necessity for aligning, right, local activism with national efforts. So I think local activists should bring pressure from below by changing the game, right? And you see this, for example, in decisions in Denver, Colorado, around budgeting with regards to mental health services, deploying mental health services with certain 911 calls. And the success of that program has led to its exponential expansion, right? How we might drive those experiments at the local level upstream, right? So figuring out how to connect it, and that has to happen not only among activists, but also politicians who move between those two. Did I answer the question or no?
No, absolutely. Thank you. That was exactly what I was wondering.
And see, at the heart of my view is my political and philosophical hero, Miss Ella Baker. And Miss Baker, who's this mastermind, she helped form NAACP chapters in the South in the early part of the 20th century. She was the first executive secretary of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. She was the force that allowed the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee to organize these young people your age and a little bit older to imagine a politics that really found its gravitas at the local level. And remember, it's the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, used the energy of fire, shall we say, these wildcat sit-ins among young folk across the country, across the South rather, and figured out a way to coordinate for a national effort. You guys have the skill set because the local is global, right? So you have to figure out how to network it in order to have an impact, not only at the local level, but at the national level and international level as well.
Thank you, Kate.
Thank you.
Next, we have Ryan from the college.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for coming to speak to us tonight. It's been a really fascinating conversation, and Professor, I really liked your shout out. I'm a Denver native myself, big fan of the implementation of the program that they've been doing there, and hopefully it'll continue to make progress. My question is about some of the resistance that this fight has met, particularly among alarmingly to me young people, and how do you suggest we best reach out to young people when particularly with social media and echo chambers, young people, particularly young white men, can find themselves in echo chambers online of hate and false information that can really be detrimental to the progress that we're trying to put in place here?
That's a great question. Oftentimes, those of us who find ourselves in these public platforms, we're often asked these questions as if we have the answers. And I want to admit up front, I don't have all of the answers. I'm trying to figure out how this information ecosystem is in so many ways distorting and disfiguring, right? American democracy, right? When you have a public that can't deliberate in a reasoned way, the idea of democracy itself is difficult to imagine, right? Working. And then you combine that with the fact that I think your generation, and I know this is going to sound strange, I think I'm right though, I describe your generation as the catastrophic generation. You guys have come of age in the midst of cascading crises. So there's a reason why you've concluded that the nation is broken. And some of your generations reaching for new vocabularies. Others are reaching for old vocabularies. There's a sense of disorder, and some are reaching for the language of order, authoritarianism, fascism. I keep telling people Dylan Roof was not a baby boomer, right? And we can go on and on. So I hear your question loud and clear. So part, I think, of the way in which we reach young people has everything to do with policy, breaking the framework of scarcity, of this zero-sum game, to use Heather McGhee's language, right? To get young folk to reject the idea that there's only so much pie to go around. I don't believe that. We can bake a bigger damn pie, you know? And so how do we shift from a framework of scarcity where you think you have to give up something in order for America to be more just, right? And instead, understand that a more just America will allow all of us to flourish, right? How do we shift that frame? And I think that has a lot to do with policy, and it has a lot to do, going back to my earlier answer to Ryan, with storytelling, right? How do we frame? That's why the Emancipator is so important. How do we frame the stories, right? And how do we disseminate information in a different way so that we don't respond to the uptick in crime with the same old language of law and order, that we begin to give a different kind of account of it, and maybe we will respond with a different policy recommendation. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your question.
Yeah, great question. And yes, you're reading my mind on storytelling and journalism. I mean, in the framing, it comes back to the journalism and to the newspapers. And if you look at the headlines and the content of the newspapers, of the Associated Press, the way that they reported Emmett Till's death and funeral, and you juxtapose those headlines with the way the Black press was covering. It's shocking and striking, and it definitely places a lot of responsibility on us as journalists. We're going to go to a question from Elia from the college.
Hi, Professor. Thank you so much for being here today. I've learned so much, and listening to your insights has been incredible so far. My question is in a similar vein, going off like your idea of like scarcity. As a biracial, American, someone who is half Chinese, half Black, I have been thinking a lot about, the Black activism and Asian activism that's happened recently due to COVID-19. And I'm just kind of curious, how these two groups can, help each other and help each other achieve their goals. And I guess like reframe this narrative and get away from the idea of like scarcity when it comes to justice. So just like would love to hear insights on that.
Thank you so much, Lee, for that question, man. It's so clear to me that, and this is Baldwin, this is at the heart of Baldwin's insight, right? That the problem isn't us. Never has been. That, when we think about Asian Americans and African Americans and folk who have been racialized, who find themselves navigating and negotiating this reality and the violence that comes with it, we try to figure out how we might, engage in solidaristic efforts to respond to the realities and conditions of our living. Well, I think justice, a clearer conception of justice, that we might acquire a clearer conception of justice in order to motivate our actions, but we need to understand that the problem rests with an idea of whiteness that's, how can I put it, that generates a sense of panic and terror, right? I think this is really, really key. There's nothing redeemable about the idea that some people, because of the color of their skin, ought to be valued more than others. There's nothing redeemable about that. That doesn't mean that folk are irredeemable, but that idea is irredeemable. And so part of our work is to fight for a more just America together, to not get trapped in a certain kind of identity politics, but to understand that there are forces that disfigure the way in which justice takes shape in this country. And one of those forces is a notion of whiteness that then leads to the devaluing of particular bodies. You see what I mean? So I want to dismantle that and all that attends to, and all that comes in its way in some ways. And we can do that together, all of us. And I mean all of us, not just people of color. I'm talking about all of us. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you for that. Our last question is going to be from Artha from the college.
I'll be short, I promise. Or short. Hi, Artha.
Hi. My question to the both of you, just to wrap us up for the evening, is how can we continue to be better storytellers? How do we tell compelling stories and bring people into our movement in a way that brings us closer together instead of farther apart?
I'm interested in what Amber has to say to that one. Yes.
I can start. I mean, I think the first thing that comes to mind for me is asset framing, which is a narrative model of defining people by their assets and their aspirations before noting the challenges and deficits. You know, a story on the south side of Chicago. What does that conjure up for you? You see a breaking news, south side of Chicago. It becomes muscle memory for us because we're so used to the way that narratives are drawn out. And I think that's a challenge for all storytellers of just asset framing instead of deficit framing, and allowing the community members who are experts on their own lived experiences to have a voice. You know, we can go to the highest levels and to the experts at the highest levels, but, you know, honoring the voices of those who are at the ground level and living it is something that I think we can do. So that's one thing.
Yeah, and just really quickly, we all can't be poets, but we all can bear witness. Open your eyes and tell the story of what you see. Right.
Amen.
So bear witness. That's how we tell better stories.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Before we turn it over back to Seti Warren, real quick, for anybody who hasn't read a book by James Baldwin yet, we won't call on them. What's the first book they could pick up this weekend?
Well, I'm going to cheat. Pick up The Price of the Ticket. It's this Baldwin's edited collection of his nonfiction work. And you can read it from beginning to end. And I think it will be an extraordinary experience for you.
Well, thank you so much.
Right here.
There it is. Hold it up. Within reach, easy, within reach reference. Thank you so much. I'm going to turn things over to Seti Warren, our Executive Director of the Institute of Politics.
Well, that was an amazing conversation. We're so grateful, Dr. Glaude, for you being here, listening to your incredibly thoughtful insights, observations on what's happening in America and what should be happening in America. And to Amber Payne, thank you for a skilled moderation and bringing this conversation to bear. So we're grateful to you both. Thank you so much. Thank you. As a reminder to the audience, a few things I want to share with you. First, you can share tonight's forum through our YouTube channel, which houses all the forums in our institutional anti-racism and accountability series. Before we go, I want to draw your attention to really an incredible lineup of forums coming up in the next few days and early next week. In just a half an hour at 7:30, we'll be joined live in the forum by the Honorable Kevin Rudd, 26th Prime Minister of Australia, for a conversation on Ukraine, China, and this will be moderated by Professor Graham Allison. Tomorrow at 6 p.m., also in person, we'll be joined by some of America's youngest officials from across the country discussing their unique experiences with politics and running for office with Peter Hamby of Snapchat. Then on Friday at 4 p.m., the forum hosts Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina for a conversation on his opportunity agenda, legislative package, and the future of bipartisanship in the U.S. Senate. That forum will be moderated by Professor Arthur Brooks. And finally, we wrap up this anti-racism series this semester with two forums next week, one on Monday and one on Wednesday. On Monday, April 4th at 6 p.m., we will host a forum on Indigenous, Black, and communities of color fighting for environmental justice. Guests will be Karen Diver, former Special Assistant on American Indian Affairs during the Obama administration, and former Fond du Lac Band of Lake Superior Chippewa chairwoman. Shamar Bibbins, who is Senior Program Officer for the Environment at Kearsarge Foundation. Governor Stephen Rowe Lewis of the Gila Ribbon Indian Community. And moderator Megan Hill, Director of the Honoring Nations Program at Harvard and the Program Director of the Harvard Project on American Indian Development. And finally, on Wednesday, April 6th at 6 p.m., we will welcome Janae Nelson, President and Director Counsel of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and Educational Fund. We will be in conversation with Dr. Khalil Muhammad, Director of the Institutional Anti-Racism and Accountability Project, Ford Foundation Professor of History, Race, and Public Policy at Harvard Kennedy School. The discussion will reflect on Nelson's tenure at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and her new role as President and Director Counsel, as well as her insights from the realities of the legal field. Once again, thank you very, very much to our panel, Dr. Glaude and Amber Payne. And thank you all for joining us this evening for this important conversation. Have a good night, everyone.